Welcome. My name is Bob Martin. I'm from MITRE, and we're going to be talking about System of Trust today. With me is...
Hi, I'm Cassie Crossley. I'm a Vice President of Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric. You might know us by some of our brand names, Square D, APC, some of those, and Aviva.
So with that, I really want to just jump in here. We did talk about System of Trust last year, and so this is a little bit of where are we now, where are we going, and also a call for people to get involved. So System of Trust is something that we started internally at MITRE and talked to you a lot about what we did there, but it's now that we're trying to get people to look at it, give us feedback, get involved, and move it forward. So the normal disclaimer, this is for educational purposes. And so I want to just start with a little bit of a premise. There's some things that people come away from talks and think they heard. And so I want to clarify that. So we're not talking about some magical database that you'll be able to get all your supply chain answers from. We're not talking about any kind of a risk management process. There's lots of those out there. They're very focused on their communities and they're great. However, most of them tell you how to manage your risk, not which risks to manage. And so that's kind of the sweet spot of what we're going to be talking about. But we're also going to be talking about how you can tailor that down to something that makes sense to you and that you can bring data against. So we're going to offer a couple different ways you can bring answers to what is the risk and is it there. So that's kind of the background. Some of the players that you hear me talking about during this are a catalog, a content management system called Risk Model Manager, our community of industry and other organizations, and our website. And then I'll tell you about some of the aspirational things we hope to do in the coming years. So, and this is just kind of a reminder, we're going to be freely licensing this material. It's available for people. We want to help people learn how to use it, bring it appropriately into standards. And so that's kind of the context and premise of what we're doing. So supply chain. Supply chains, doesn't really matter what kind of supply chain you're talking about. You're going to have harvested or man-created things. Well, then you have various intermediate goods, and then they go through some production and distribution, and eventually you get to a customer, and then sometimes you have a disposal phase. And the reason this is all a problem is because of the international nature. And one of the reasons it's international is transportation costs have just plummeted. It's really economical to move raw goods, intermediate goods, or finished goods anywhere. And so this is not going away. So how do we deal with that? So when we think about supply chains, there may be people focused on ICT, computers, software, that kind of thing. There could be people who are really about the services, whether that be cloud type of services or maybe it's warehousing as a service, depends on your industry. You also have people that are focused on the goods and the quality of the goods and making sure they're not tampered with and so on. Or counterfeits. We're worried about counterfeits in different industries. There's different ways of detecting them. Or you could just be worried about the logistics and moving things. You may be in a specialty area that's highly regulated or have safety issues. Or it could be I'm worried about my suppliers and whether they'll be there or that they could be a nefarious path to me. Or you just may be trying to buy stuff. And the trouble is when you talk about risks, we're trying to talk to each other and we're all talking different language, different abstractions, and it's very confusing, a lot of wasted energy. So that's one of the things we hope System of Trust is going to help. So third-party risk management, that's a starting point, but do the people who are working it actually understand all the subtleties of third-party risk management? Do they also understand attacks and counterfeits, all the hazards from Mother Nature or those from humankind? So System of Trust is meant to be that starting place and the holistic in nature in all the things you may need to manage from a risk point of view. So we've been sponging in, hoovering, vacuuming in, collecting, whatever word you want to use for it, everything we can find from every perspective about risks that can come from your supply chain, whether it be from the supplier, the supply, or the service. So if we did that and got it all nicely organized, we'd totally fail. And the reason we'd failed is no one could actually do something with that massive amount of risks. So we have this idea of a profile, and it's a very fundamental concept that you can identify a subset of the overall corpus and use that effectively. So the basis of our organization is, you may have guessed, supplier, supply, and services. And we've identified 14 top-level risk areas. And these are important because you don't want to come up with one number. Because if you have a very high risk in one area and all the other risk areas are low or moderate, it doesn't average out. That high risk is a high risk. You need to be able to pay attention to it. You need to think of it as a showstopper depending on what it is. So we don't average those things out, but they do break down into more details. And they keep breaking down to the point where you can actually get data, put that data against the risk question and say, yes, that risk is actually present, or no, I can't find any evidence that risk is there. So depending on which area you're focused on, you'll be going down into depth. Now, there are some concepts that we don't have in our categories. They're there, but they're just not encapsulated the way some people in industry are talking about. So we're going to have to do some mappings so that if you're really, interested in forced labor, you know where those pieces are in the others. So when you look at it, this is what it comes out at basically the top three levels. So you can see here that the three colors are the supply, the service, and then there's details below it. But I just showed you those in the past slide. But when you look at the whole thing, it gets a little overwhelming. And so that's why we need the ability to do a profile. But at the edges of this is where the evidence comes in. That's where the actual questions that you need answers to so that you can manage this. So just having that context. Now, when people think about doing risk assessment, they say, oh, I'm going to go get data on the web, or I'm going to get it from some commercial provider, or I'm going to go, do a questionnaire. But there's other sources. So, whoops, wrong part of this. I want to tell about the tool. How do we do that profiling? So we have a knowledge model underneath this, and we have a tool. The tool is a prototype. It's basically what we use to build our knowledge set. It's also what you can use to navigate it and identify that profile and export that subset. So think of that as kind of a questionnaire. So you can export it as a spreadsheet so that you can go evaluate it somewhere other than on MITRE's systems. Because once you start actually assessing, it's going to get sensitive quickly, right? So we've been doing piloting, and one of the things we found from the piloting, it's really important how you present the results. So we don't expect to be doing the middle, where it's all summed up to one number. We do expect to have either the spider graph or some way of showing all the hits on high risk so people can go look at it and say, oh, no, that disqualifies you. If you go to the US to get a clearance and you answer the 26-page questionnaire and one answer is, yes, I'm a known convicted felon, it doesn't matter what you put in all the other questions. And there's similar risk assessments in other areas. So wrapping it together, we have a knowledge model. We're building system of trust from that. You come in with a specific concept or a point of view, you get a subset of system of trust, and then you do assessment against that. If you have a different concept, a different type of situation, you get a different part of the subset of the overall risks, and then you assess against that. So what does an assessment look like? This is an example. It's one we did using available data sources. So it was something that you could do in a couple hours. Now, through automation, you can probably do this quicker, but that's, that's one of the places we're trying to explore going to. But the idea here is you can see where the risks are, there's data behind this, and then you can ask, well, can I mitigate that, or do I need to go on to somebody else? When you look at that overarching set of risk questions, some of them you're going to say, well, if I follow a particular standard, I may actually mitigate that. So what we want to do is map those standards that are out there and actually show which risk questions, areas you're actually addressing, so that when you are doing an assessment, if you've marked that somebody followed that standard, in the question it would say that means that they've met the following 3 requirements, and you can decide whether that's relevant to you. So we're doing this for 62443 and ISO 20243, which is about malicious taint and counterfeits. So we hope to do it for many standards, and we actually hope to have the standards groups help us with the mapping. So bottom line, we're trying to do this so that you have repeatable, structured way of doing this. And just to wrap up on this first section, think about this as we're building a questionnaire, and we have a knowledge base that has all of the potential questions you could ask. And so you're going to go and review that and identify the ones you want to use. That's the tailoring that builds a profile, and then you do assessment against that. So when you look at our risk model manager, which is our way of building our content, you can view and you can tailor, and we use it to actually edit and change. So we have that already. We're in the midst of making it into something you can do assessment with, but it's just a framework. It's not bringing in data. So it's an online questionnaire almost. What we hope to do is for those where there are known structured data sources, we can actually do an API to those. Now, whether you have the credentials to go get the data is a different issue. But the idea is that there are a lot of things, maybe a third of these, that you could automate. But then there's going to be the other 2/3 that you have to do real work. So just for your reference in the slides, this is the model we're using. It's a cloud-native AWS application. It's going to be open sourced. It's not there yet. It still needs some maturing, and parts of this architecture are not implemented yet. But we really think this is going to let us bring together, what are the risks we're managing, and how are we going to, get to a better place together. So one part of that is our community. So we've started since December actively engaging for feedback from people in the industries that we've connected with, and ask them to review our material, help us build it out. And who are the people in that? You can read, but basically, if you look, you'll see some of them are from a software supply chain expertise. Some of them are very knowledgeable in microelectronics supply chain. Some really are about device supply chains. Devices can be automobiles, or they can be control systems for water plants. Some are about assessing supply chains. You know, they're the vendors that help you assess your supply chain. And then there's some standards groups. So with that, I'll let Cassie come over.
Great, thanks, Bob. So the system of trust work that MITRE's been doing is really, let's say, expansive. And enterprise companies have had this type of work going on, but not a model to follow. And I think that I'll show you what we've been doing over the years and how we're going to work with MITRE on this piece. So I mentioned earlier, Schneider Electric, we're a very large company, 34 billion euro over the last year. We have a number of locations. If I look at smart products from a standpoint, it's over 16,000 SKUs, so a lot of items, software, physical devices, big systems like industrial control systems. What we have is a very mature supply chain strategy. We have, I think the number is somewhere around 65,000 suppliers. I mean, that's a lot of suppliers to have to go through. They can be of any type, whether it be smart components or let's just say plastics or metal or anything like that. So our supply chain strategy has been evolving over decades, and obviously we're in a security conference, right? And security really is a new function in supply chain discussions. It's added on, and the security function is not the same. If I'm buying a product for from my standard enterprise word processing or anything like that, it's going to have different questions than if I'm discussing with a manufacturer who is actually going to have access to our product as it goes down a line. Very different questions. And so being able to understand the risk profile of that supplier and where they are is very important from a security perspective. And it's not a standard, oh, these are the questions you ask. And that's the answer. Well, a cloud provider is going to have very different set of questions than someone who might be flashing the hardware. And so from our supply chain strategy, we do that assessment. And so what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about what we have been focusing on over the years. This is not just like what Bob was showing. It's not all the details. It's really sort of groupings. Environment, obviously, there's a lot of regulations, California Prop 65 and just different ones. Business practices are very important. We are a very proud company of our business practices that we have. Health and safety, I mean, that's a lot of our business. We need to make sure that our suppliers are also having those health and safety requirements that we expect. Human rights, definitely being a global company with manufacturing all over the world, extremely important. And sustainability. Sustainability is really our top line. In fact, our annual report is called a sustainability report. So these are already items that we are assessing suppliers on. And of course, there's business, let's just say the financial concerns and things like that. So we have a supplier process that has, you go through an approval just for us to even be able to assess that supplier. There's basic conditions that you want to start with, and then we qualify those suppliers. And when you're in a manufacturing process, qualification is very important. You need to make sure that they're meeting all the requirements down to whatever you're purchasing from. It can be a very detailed, long process to make sure they qualify on all the different levels, financial and all the different areas. And then performance. This is not a once and done, right? This is a continuous process. And I think we'll see over the years this system of trust is it evolves, right? And when you're setting up your profiles, are you concerned about the performance, the business continuity,
Right.
the resilience of that supplier? It's extremely important. And radar charts, we like those up there. So we've been assessing it for cybersecurity on 9 different areas. Again, it can be very different on the assessment depending on the supplier. Product design and validation may not apply for a certain supplier. It depends on how they're doing it. Detailed design in firmware and software. I have the team for the third-party risk management on product security. If I'm buying a library from somebody, if I'm buying, a component, a smart component, we go through a very evidence-based process because that detailed design is important, and we're going to see more of that with software attestation and everything that's out there. So the cybersecurity dimensions are growing because that impacts a lot of the other areas that we're seeing in the system of trust. And then that performance that I mentioned, they are evaluated over time, especially critical suppliers, quarterly reviews, annual reviews. If something's not performing to standards, immediate setup. Critical suppliers have a CISO to CISO Connect, so I meet with our critical suppliers. So this.
Well, and that's an important thing,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes people think about a supply chain assessment as a one and done type of thing. It's an engagement.
It is. It is. And then, let's see. There we go. And so we have, questionnaires. I know lots of people don't like questionnaires. If you read the answers to the questionnaires, then there's value in it. I review questionnaires, especially of my critical suppliers, before I have a meeting with them. Before we approve them to be put into a product, there's a detailed review. There's a lot of work that goes into it. I answer lots of questionnaires, and I'm surprised that I don't get answers back like, why did you answer this partial? Well, here, let me explain why. Because when people send out global questionnaires, I have, as I said, 16,000 smart products. They don't all work the same. Every supplier, you could be, if you're working with a large enterprise supplier, they have different business units, they have different lines of businesses, they operate differently. So there's a lot of variation that can happen if you're going down to that specific level. And so we are working to enhance working with MITRE because we have that experience, but also I'm working with suppliers every day. And now with especially attestations, and I say, how are you vetting your suppliers? And if they're a mid-size or small or a startup, they don't have a supplier assessment process.
Right.
And they're not going to be able to, in some cases, afford or be able to bring on the right supplier assessment. So being able to say, hey, there's a manufacturing profile for this, in system of trust. Hey, there's this. You might want to look at this cloud profile that is established so that you can do something. And I think that working with the standards group, like, and alliances like Cloud Security Alliance and all of them, it comes to the same, similar language. So we definitely want to look at that, but also do an internal analysis for my process, be able to map to it. Because if you look at all of those different areas, performance metrics especially, some of that data I may not have automated. And what it's going to do is give me ideas, hey, maybe I should make this a requirement so I can get an automated item, an automated data feed, so that I have that information in the future to be able to work on that performance. And then obviously provide feedback to the system of trust. That's one of our goals, is to work with that, because a lot of our peers, partners, suppliers, everybody who's shown we're a big supporter of 62443. We've got a lot of knowledge to help provide some background to it. So.
Okay. Thanks, Cassie. So that's kind of where we got to today. So what are we going forward? So we've distributed a version 1.2 to that group come last December. We've incorporated feedback from 21 different organizations, and next week we will be rolling out a 1.3 to our website, to our online risk model management tool, and there'll be a downloadable equivalent to this Word document that has all the details. So that's something coming forward. Now, the other part of what we're trying to do is figure out where can we get the data for these risk questions. So in our knowledge model, there's a part where we can save that kind of information, and we have it for some. But what we want to do is, when you get into our tool, you'll be able to say, here's a bunch of sources of data, and it'll have details about where you can go, what kind of data you can get from there. And it'll also be mapped to the risk question that data could answer, so that when you actually get into assessment mode, there's a little area that says, well, how am I going to answer this? Is it I'm going to go do general research and somebody's going to get evidence and enter it in? Or am I going to go to Bloomberg, or am I going to go to Dun Bradstreet, or am I going to go get a unit, bring it into the workbench and decompose it and destructively test it? So how do I get the data? And that's a big part of what we're trying to get the community to involve, because guess what? They're doing that. You do get data from somewhere. Now, maybe there's other sources of that data. Maybe we can all learn better, but we want to gather that and do that as a community. So the other part is that some of those data sources are available online, whether it's a government site, some public website of some sort, or somebody that you can actually buy a service from. And so we want to automate bringing in those kinds of structured data. You may need a credential for some of them, but the idea is we've put together this framework, and basically the first part is, well, where is the data? Is there a URL, that I can go find it? The next one is, how do I access that data? This is where you may need to log in, you may need to have a credential. So, but we're trying to get this into discrete little pieces that people can write down in a structured way, and we can then use that to automate. So the next one is, how do I actually retrieve the data? Do I have to go through some forms? Do I need to do a query, select some things? And then, how do I understand what comes back? And this is a big part where we want the community's help. So when I look at data that's supposed to tell me about a risk, how do I interpret it to determine whether it's high risk, no risk, somewhere in the middle? Right now, that's in a lot of subject matter experts' heads, and we need to capture it, concur on it, and make it available to a much broader audience of people so that we don't have that.
And what we talked about is your risk profiles may be very different. I have very established risk profiles, and so being able to modify and adjust is something that you'll also be able to do.
Right. In the profiles, when you look at the material, there's default weights for how important this particular, if it is a moderate risk, what does that mean? But when you make the profile, you can adjust those. So for you, if you find that evidence, it may be, stop everything, this is a showstopper. Whereas for somebody else, it's like, no, we can manage that in our current process. So that's adjustable and available. So then the next part, the final part is, how do you get this stuff back into the RMM so you can have it as evidence, and when you're all done, you can actually have what you looked at, how you evaluated it, and the basis that you had. So that's coming. It's going to be using AWS's Lambda functions. So whatever you're assessing, the system won't know. It'll just come through, pass you back the result. So we don't want it, laying around all that assessment data. So if you want to get an account on the RMM, on our website, there's a drop-down menu that lets you get to this page. We've already have over 200 people that are getting accounts this week. Took us a little while to get our process in place. We were expecting a dozen or two. But we're ready to scale now, and so that's available. So the kinds of things we think people should be doing is, go to the website, look at it, and think about whether or not those things are things you should be managing, or if there's missing things. Talk to your suppliers and your customers about System of Trust as a way of clarifying the discussion, so that you're not using the same words to mean different things and leaving things up in the air. Please give us feedback. When I was going through the show floor just yesterday, ran into a company that has a very niche product, but they actually identified some supply chain risks that I hadn't thought about, and they volunteered to join and add them in. So there's a lot of different risks that can come from your supply chain. So join the community, engage. We're going to be, also looking at when somebody asks you, what is your supply chain? How do you express that? There's no real standard for that. So one of our side projects we hope to do is, it's not that you should capture your supply chain this way day to day, but if somebody asks for it, it'd be nice if there was a standard way of expressing that, so that when there's a crisis, when somebody all of a sudden needs to figure out, what's the issues with PPE, we can, understand the supply chain quicker and actually address it. So, the bottom line of this is, we have System of Trust. Please contact us. Please look at the material. Get involved. If there's things we're missing, let us know. We're wide open for feedback. We hope this will actually transform the way people talk about supply chains, much the way ATT&CK has changed the way people talk about defending their enterprise. So with that, our website is available. There's papers there, and we're open for Q&A. So please use the microphones. Love your questions.
While someone's coming up, I've got a question for you. On the exchange that you're thinking about, will it be able to do it at the product level? So because my supply chain, you don't want to see the whole thing. It would be a bit messy.
Yeah, no, I think it should be able to have elements that are tailorable, but it needs to be really simple, as well as able to grow and scale. So that's the general idea. Yes, sir.
I work for a company that makes network security cameras, so we have our own quite complex supply chain, but we also are part of supply chain as well. And one of the most frustrating things I ever see is we get supply chain questionnaires, and they're for like a cloud service. So I spend half of my time saying not applicable, not applicable, not applicable. Will there be sort of, I would say, more generic profiles for, say, network devices or these kind of things that a customer, that us as a vendor could maybe pre-answer or have answers kind of pre-prepared that we could just provide to a customer and simplify that whole process, because it is quite painstaking.
Right. So that's one of our goals, is to identify profiles that we can then publish, and you then using that to put together a set of answers, whether it's on your website or just a response you send when people ask. I've also seen people say, I want to build a profile that I'm going to then advertise and tell people, if you want to do business with me, here's how I'm going to look at you. And, so be aware.
Because I also find customers are not asking the right questions often. They're asking the wrong ones, which is not really beneficial for them either, right? So.
Yep, no, good question. Yes, sir.
At this point in time, on your SOT, is there some good guidance about how we could structure policies? I still have a lot of my clients, I'm in the consulting business, who have very poor to non-existent cybersecurity, in particular, policies around supply chain. But one of the things I want to do, and I like what you're doing here, is not have a separate cybersecurity supply chain. I want to have them integrated into the procurement process so they're speaking the same language. So what type of guidance is there about how to structure future policies at the high level so that as this tool gets implemented in the future, their policies can be aligned with like some of the risks that you're talking about here?
Right. So, you know, there's no secret place to write policy. There's lots and lots of groups involved. And so we've been doing our best to engage different groups that shape and write policy to get them to think about that holistic nature of this and that there needs to be consistency. So I don't know a perfect answer, but it's basically, you know, engage, discuss. If those kinds of people don't see the value of this, what are we doing wrong in the messaging? This weekend, I actually talked to the American Bar Association's technical committee about this, who do a lot of advice on due diligence in the overall supply chain. And so those kinds of engagements, I think, will get us there. But if you know, anyone knows a good approach or a better approach.
I was going to ask, did you mean internal corporate policy or government policies?
Corporate policy.
Okay.
So this conversation comes up a lot when I'm speaking with my suppliers, especially, let's say, less advanced ones. And when you ask for policies on cybersecurity, you know, things like that, they generally have acceptable use, that kind of structure. But they, you know, not just cybersecurity policies, but other policies, you really, by setting those measurements, you're actually having the conversation with with those internal teams to say, what is your policy? Because it is a risk profile.
Right.
You want to say, for this type of vendor, this is what it is. So that creates the policy that can be technical in nature so that it can alert instead of being a written Word document or something at that level. But I think it definitely drives that conversation.
Yeah, sorry, I misunderstood
That's
your
okay.
question.
Yeah.
Because we also have that other level
Yes.
of policy. Sir.
So I manage research for a cyber risk scoring solution, and we use MITRE cybersecurity frameworks for that. But you know, there are other vendors in the system. They all use different scoring methodologies. So does MITRE have a risk scoring standardization as part of this program?
So there's a set of papers that we wrote several years ago about a common approach to risk scoring. The trouble is that there's different communities have kind of latched on to different approaches to doing that scoring. So I'm not sure we're going to ever get to one. We're hoping to get translatable risk approaches. The good point is if you have a defined one, you can at least understand it and then figure out how it applies. Or my biggest concern is that some of the measurement approaches are, you know, they kind of look into a data lake and pull out bad things that they see, but you don't know what they missed, you know, and that's why we're focusing on the risk factors. You know, if I can find data for this, great. If I can't, then there's some uncertainty, and I need to know when I don't have the data, and that's one of our biggest issues. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for presentation. I have a question that do you also align your risk profiles with known security standards, or not, for instance, then if your supplier is certified against security ISO, then part of your risks are low or something
Yeah,
like that.
exactly. So I tried to show the mapping one slide. Basically, we are working with standards groups to lay out their standard, and where one of their requirements gives you insight to one of our risk questions, we want to map those two so that when you go to do an assessment, you say, oh, they followed these standards. That then brings into the actual questionnaire you see, by the way, they followed 2001, which means they did this in this particular risk area. So we think there's a big savings in doing that, but it takes a lot of effort.
And if they've already got the certification, it's just like, done. They don't have to go back and answer the questions,
Right.
right? Because the mapping's there.
How you doing? Robert and Cassie. I'm a critical infrastructure protection auditor with CERC, and so we audit the power companies. SIP 13 became enforceable back in July 2020, and it's a struggle, right? So this is really, really neat. When it comes to the mapping element here, it sounds like it's work to be done.
Yep.
And so, how can we get involved to help, or rather, how can any other, standard groups get involved?
Yeah, get involved in the community. We hope in this coming year to have the ability for you to log in, map out your standard in detail, subparagraph, paragraph down to the bottom, and then for each of those that are applicable, identify which risk factor they map to, where you would own it, because you'll evolve your standard, but we want to be able to then look at that and harvest it into our work.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have an account, but before then, you can still talk with all of us and say, hey, I have insight to these kinds of things. Is that a risk that's actually in your hierarchy? Because there's things that standards were written to address that we may not have on our map yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm on the NERC supply chain working group. So
Very good.
Tom Hofstadter, being able to get somebody, some folks that are really passionate about the topic to work on the SOT is going to be important. And there's not, it's really more almost a mapping exercise. And again, to identify where it can be improved, the SOT, to say, this is the language we used, or this is our situation. And so I think, and same with, you can use any standard section. I get emails, are you compliant with this framework and this framework and this, and there's a lot around.
And there's room in so at the very top of the hierarchy down to like 4 or 5 levels, it doesn't care what business you're in.
Right.
So it's down at the lower levels that we could even have domain-specific standards mapped in. So it's very flexible in that nature.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank
both.
you. Any more questions? Well, I'll give you a couple minutes back. Thank you.
Thank you all.